Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Cheka-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year, both here on site and virtually. Today is our final spring Book Sandwiched In review. We'll be back here in September for the fall series. For news of summer programming, you can visit our website, ffrpl.org, subscribe to our e-newsletter if you haven't already, visit us on Facebook, check the library's online calendar, or pick up printed calendars at the circulation desks. FFRPL is happy to help plan and promote a special summer jazz series on the first 3 Tuesdays in June. The concerts will be held at 12 noon in the Reading Garden, just adjacent, or here in the auditorium in case of rain. Those concerts will feature on June 6th, Kayla Sconier's voice, Ben Snyder on trombone, and Bob Snyder on guitar. June 13th will be Leon Siu on piano, Stephanie Tatiana on saxophone, and June 20th, Dave Krisham on trumpet and Aaron Stable on drums. Then, the Popular Jazz Starts Here concert series will run every day, beginning on Monday, the week of June 26th. Those will also be free concerts from 12 noon until 1 p.m., also in the Reading Garden or here in the auditorium in case of rain. Today's review is of the book Who's Raising the Kids? Big Tech, Big Business, and the Lives of Children by Susan Linn, a world-renowned expert on the impact of our digitized, commercialized culture on kids. In their starred review, Publishers Weekly described the book as a stunning examination of how marketing, technology, and consumer capitalism impact the well-being of our children. Our reviewer today is Elenia Neschio, Clinical Professor of Marketing at the University of Rochester. Please welcome Elena to our podium.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am honored to be closing this season of Book Sandwiched In with this review. And thank you, Susan, for the brief introduction. So by day, I teach at the University of Rochester Simon Business School. I come from an industry background and am specialized in digital marketing. But if we're really being honest, my day job is raising these two, if we can see them. Oh, of course, now the clicker isn't going to work. There we are. That's my daughter and my son. My daughter is 10 going on 16, and my son is 12. And so digital really is a part of my everyday life, every waking hour, both professionally and personally. And so this book was really meaningful for me on a number of fronts, and I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about it with you. Okay, this is just not going to work now. So let me introduce you to Susan Linn. So Susan is the author of this book and has written a couple of other titles on similar topics around the impact of marketing and business on consumerism in children and consumerism of play. She is a psychologist by trade with a focus on childhood development, and she's an accomplished ventriloquist, having appeared on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood with her puppet. And in her book, Who's Raising the Kids?, the central thesis is that the interests of business and marketing and technology are directly in conflict with the development of children. And effectively, what tech companies are doing is creating a passive, potentially dysfunctional generation of consumers who are unable to think critically about products. It's a pretty bold thesis. And the way that she approaches this topic, she starts from a foundation of what do children need to be healthy, to develop. And in this regard, she leans on her practice as a ventriloquist and as a psychologist to identify the things that children need. And frankly, she goes squarely after any toys that inhibit that positive growth. Anything that makes noise, has lights, has buttons, or other types of bells or whistles. Really pushing hard, pushing back on anything that inhibits unbridled imagination and creativity. Now, as a parent, that is a pretty far stretch from reality in that she advocates fiercely for wooden toys, blocks, arts and crafts, and it's a very ambitious and maybe a bit romantic idea around what is reality as a parent and for children. She closes the introduction with saying that the businesses can't satisfy these needs for children. It is, again, directly in contrast with their own goals of maximizing profits, which is a very narrow view of what businesses do. She also, in her introduction, raises her hand and says, I'm not looking to offend anyone. I'm not taking any jabs at parents. I know it's a hard job. And yet throughout the book, there is a fair bit of that feeling of condescension and wagging of the finger and admission that, well, when I was a parent raising my kids, I could take a book to the park and read my book while my child played. And now parents are on their smartphones. And so while she presents this as her reality, she owns only to a small degree that it is no longer the reality for those of us who are actively raising children. Some of us still like books. But many of us are also reading on other devices as well. After this initial foundation and setup, Linn goes into specific verticals around technology. And that's the structure of the majority of the book. It goes beyond social media and technology, and she talks about a number of different areas where you may or may not be thinking about the impact of marketing and technology. She talks about gaming and social gaming, those connected games you probably have heard of, Minecraft, Roblox, and Fortnite, and how children are playing them and socializing with one another through gaming. She talks about branding. And what was really interesting about that chapter was that she not only talks about the impact of brands as we know them on children, which is nothing new, but she talks about how children are now branding themselves. And that was an interesting point where I really hadn't considered. They are creating their own content. They are curating their feeds and curating their online personas, branding themselves for their peers. She talks about the commercialization of childhood again. This extends beyond technology. She talks about how you simply can't have any experience without there being an opportunity to make a purchase. She uses the example of a father taking his daughter to gymnastics, and on the way to dropping her off, there is a shop where she can buy branded leotards or sweatshirts or water bottles, and how every opportunity, both digital and analog, is effectively an opportunity to make a purchase. She talks about reward systems. And this chapter for me, I took a bit of issue because she simplifies the premise of rewards in saying that we are now training a generation not to love learning or perform any type of behaviors unless there is some type of a reward or incentive. Well, for being honest, how many children are running to do their chores without the promise of an allowance? And so rewards exist. We use them as a tool. She exaggerates this a bit more in saying that now, they don't want to learn unless there is some type of badging or certificate or award. And so I think there's a little bit of hyperbole in this chapter in particular, but it is still certainly an interesting concept to think about. The next chapter, she talks about the nag factor or pester power, how marketers and businesses access much bigger wallets in parents through marketing in children. Again, this is nothing new, and so while it is put in the context of digital and technology, these are not new phenomenon that we're addressing. The last two chapters of the book, she talks about education and how technology has infiltrated every aspect of the classroom. How we are now shifting from education more toward edutainment, where there is a prioritization of the entertainment and less of the focus on necessarily the education components. We're gamifying, we are finding ways to make our classrooms more entertaining for children. And is that really appropriate? There is a chapter also on devices, and she takes quite a bit of time to talk about smart speakers. If you're not familiar with that term, those are the Alexa Echo devices or Google that you may have in your home that you can wake up and ask a prompt. This chapter for me was probably the most problematic in that the way that she was presenting it is very different from the reality of these devices. Frankly, these devices are operating at a loss for these organizations. The first wave of layoffs at Amazon was in their devices and services category because it is not profitable. People use this as a means for search and for answering questions. And so the examples she includes in that chapter in particular are a bit forced and staged and not actually grounded in how these devices are being used. So that one I took a bit of issue, but she does talk about other devices, which is interesting. And so as I was thinking about this review and what I would talk with you about, frankly, I could talk about any of these for the whole afternoon and probably build an entire semester of content. We've got other things to do today. And so I started to step back and really think more about what are we actually really talking about. And it pushed me into a more philosophical and ethical place. But before we get there, let's take a minute and just define who are these kids to whom she keeps referring. You very likely have heard of Gen Z. Gen Z are the individuals who were born between 1996 and 2010. They are between the ages of 13 and 28 this year. They are overwhelmingly the children of Gen X. And Gen X is a small generational cohort, and so this generation is also actually a much smaller generational cohort. When we think about Gen Z, we think about how they grew up with the internet. They were growing up and developing in parallel to how the internet was growing up and developing. We think about the penetration of high-speed broadband internet in 1996, even through 2010, and how it was developing and changing and evolving. Facebook didn't open up to non-college students until 2008. It was only 2 years later that this generational cohort, we have that official cutoff for them. And so they were developing and maturing in parallel. This is the first digitally native generation. Millennials, again, they are not kids. I'm a millennial. We are in our 30s and some of us are in our 40s. They were, in some ways, digitally native, but overwhelmingly they still had a lot more analog experiences. If we look at this age range, though, we're only talking about a third of these as kids, 13 to 18. So again, who are these kids we're talking about? Well, they're the alpha babies. Generation Alpha, they are 12 or under this year. Both of my children are alphas. And they were born starting in 2011. We expect the cutoff to be 2025-ish. The powers that be have not yet determined what the end of that generational cohort will be. I am not the powers that be. What's interesting about this generational cohort, again, 100% digitally native born, but they are growing up on the internet. Critical distinction there. The internet that they are growing up on looks very similar to the internet that we have today. They have been on Instagram, their parents' Instagram, because their parents are millennials, from the moment they were born. Their concepts of privacy are non-existent. They've never had privacy. Their naked baby pictures are all over social media. And what's interesting with this generation, and what is also really distinguishing from Gen Z, is how old they were during the pandemic. They were 10 and younger. Those formative elementary years were suddenly transitioned to 100% digital. They were going to school in a digital environment. They were socializing in digital. A lot of the needs that they had were coming through digital means and being satisfied that way. And so when we think about this generation, they think of digital as a natural extension of their everyday life. They are indifferent from physical to digital. They are 100% seamlessly integrated. Okay, so we've got an idea of who these kids are. So now maybe we can ask the question then, who should be raising the kids? And I don't think there would be too much dissent for me to say that the primary responsibility falls with parents, caregivers, okay? And then we might think about families and friends and how they are responsible for raising kids. And then we can pull back and think about the overwhelming amount of time that children spend with educators and their role in raising kids and communities. And I suspect these four levels, there's not too much discussion or debate. We're all, yeah, that's right, in terms of who should be raising the kids. But what about public figures? Legislators and the government, businesses. Now, this is where the discussion happens, isn't it? Should they be raising the kids? Is it their responsibility? And at what level? Let's talk about each of these. So let's start with our public figures. Public figures, this is not new. Children have had role models outside of the home for as long as they've been able to have role models. Celebrities, athletes, musicians, actors. What's different now is when we think about celebrities, and celebrities are famous for something in their profession, something they have done. Again, they're athletes, they're musicians, they are actors. We have a new generation of what are called influencers. And influencers are those individuals who are famous for creating content on the internet. They can transcend into a level of celebrity. Many of them do, not all. But influencers provide a level of access to their audiences that celebrities do not. Again, influencers are famous for creating content. And so they need a large volume of content. And so with influencers, we are there, we meet their significant others, we meet their pets, we see their homes, we unbox their new packages with them, we get ready with them, we go on vacation with them. And so we develop these intimate relationships, these parasocial relationships that mimic a real life interaction and depth of influence on us. And parasocial relationships, that's a concept from sociology that dates back to the 50s. Again, this is not new. But what is new is the depth and degree to which we think about how this is manifesting. Now, again, we can talk all afternoon about influencers and parasocial relationships, but I want to get back to the book. And so I want to shift away from the idea of public figures and think about our influencers, frankly, as businesses. Because they get a fair bit of money from the viewership of their channels through sponsorships and partnerships, but they're also merchandisers. And so everything that you're seeing on this slide is a product that was either developed by an influencer or includes their branding. They are in the business of selling products. So we'll put a pin in that. Let's talk about those legislators I mentioned, those government officials. What is their role in raising the kids? As an academic, certainly there is a big role that legislators play. There we go. As an academic, if I perform any type of research, children are a protected population. There are additional levels and additional scrutiny from institutional review boards for anything that involves children. And this is governed by the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. This doesn't exist for businesses. As academics and researchers, we are held to a certain standard of care for children, but that doesn't extend to outside the academic arena. When we think about businesses and how they've been regulated, we have to go back, we have to take a trip in our time machine back to the 80s. Because there had been some legislation around marketing to children. And it was largely rolled back under President Reagan, and this is Mark Fuller, who is the head of the FCC. He was appointed by Reagan. And so in the 1980s, there was a period of deregulation. And effectively, it was removing all of these requirements for businesses in terms of how they marketed to children. Now, of course, the 1980s is a very different time from today, but the seeds that were planted there have ultimately grown into the tree that we are now in the shade of. There are actually only 2 laws in existence as it relates to children and technology or digital media. The first is COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It was first passed in 1998 and revised in 2013. This law requires that all marketers, any type of website or social media has parental consent for anyone under the age of 13. In this case, the government is very squarely saying it is the parents' responsibility to monitor and to raise their children in a digital environment. Now, what's interesting is it designates 13 as the age of consent. My son is 12. He'll be 13 in February. He is not old enough to consent to anything. The second law is SIPA. This is the Children's Internet Protection Act. This was passed in 2000, revised in 2011. And SIPA stipulates that any federal funding for schools or libraries, those recipients must institute software programs that prevent children from being exposed to harmful content, things like obscene images, vulgar, sexually explicit images, putting the responsibility on educators. They're also requiring that schools develop curricula around internet safety. There are some other laws that are in progress right now, but none of them have been passed into legislation. So that brings us to our businesses. What's their role? And this is where Linn, I think, is a little too firm in her position, where she emphatically states that businesses are solely in the practice and of the interest of maximizing profits. That's true for some, but it actually is in the minority. If we think about theories of social responsibility in businesses, that's one end of the spectrum. But it is a spectrum. The other end, we can think about corporate citizenship, righting wrongs, justice. And if we think of that as the ends of the spectrum, there is certainly a lot of variability in the middle, and that's where most businesses are. We can think about the moral minimum, not doing harm or compensating when there is harm. This is Google's principle, don't be evil. You can hear it right there. And then we can think about stakeholder interests. And stakeholder interest broadens the definition around whose interests we're serving beyond stockholders and financial partners to include our communities, our consumers, our partners, our employees. And so most companies are in this middle. But what is interesting is then when we think about stakeholders, we can start to make utilitarian conversations and discussions around whose interests do we care most about. And then it becomes effectively a mathematical equation. And so as we're thinking about this, there is a concept that Linn actually incorrectly identifies and dismisses in the book that I want to bring forward, which is the idea of self-regulation. Now, at face value, it sounds like, it sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? So self-regulation, though, is not Meta or Facebook regulating itself. That's not what it is at all. Self-regulation is an industry-level, independent organization that is a consortium of the firms who are in the industry. And they determine what is right, what is ethical, and set forward practices and policies, and enforce them. They understand better the rate of innovation, change, what's important for these firms, where some of the opportunities are for maybe doing harm, and opportunities for addressing more needs than the government ever could. It's not possible for the government to keep up with the rate of change that's happening in digital. This has been a really successful model across a lot of industries already. You may not realize how many of them you are familiar with. The ESRB is responsible for the ratings on software and video games. The Motion Picture Association of America, it's another Reagan reference, that is responsible for the ratings of movies. If any of you have worked at Constellation Brands, then you are familiar with the Distilled Spirits Council, and there are others. But what these firms do is they hold one another accountable because no one is watching you more than your competitors. And that's exactly what they're doing. They take the businesses and use them to hold each other accountable. And so it is a softer regulation, but actually, generally speaking, more impactful. So when I'm thinking about this book and considering if it's a worthwhile read, if you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, neighbors, cousins, you should probably read this book. In some parts, it is a bit pedantic and meandering. If you can be patient with those parts, then it is absolutely worthwhile to understand the depth at which marketers and technology companies are influencing children and able to manipulate some of the conversations. There's a very rich resource section in the back for how you can get more involved, how you can have these conversations, and how you can take a little bit of that ownership back. Okay, I think we have maybe just a little bit of time for some questions. Great.